Okay, so I'm back with a new way of lecturing that I'm kind of excited about. So in the last section of this unit, we're going to talk about a few final theories and really three of our most modern criminological theories. We had stopped off talking about social control theory, and that theory you'll see to have continued influence on these modern theories, because the first two that we'll talk about really have a strong tie to social control theory. So the first is power control theory. Power control theory argues that capitalist gender relations, are reproduced in a family in a way that governs their gender roles, governs their family structure, and governs their family management. So what does this mean? Capitalist gender relations is referring to what we see out in the employment arena, out in the workplace, out in the political sphere, right? But especially in the employment world, where it's not just that men outnumber women, which at the time that this theory came out, they still did, but it's more about that glass ceiling, right? Men tend to be in the positions of dominance, and women tend to be in the more supportive, administrative, supportive positions, right? So they're more likely to be obeying or having to take commands from males who are in dominant positions as CEOs and bosses and supervisors. That, this theory argues, gets reproduced within the home. And that informs basically how people parent their children, right? In quote-unquote patriarchal families, where you really see capitalist relations reproduced in the most direct way, fathers are providing instrumental control and mothers are providing the relational control. So instrumental control refers to supervision, discipline, punishment, just wait until your dad gets home, that sort of phenomenon. And relational control just refers to the emotional side, the communication, the nurturing necessary in child rearing. Right? Now, when this occurs in the patriarchal family, what we tend to see, according to this theory, is that daughters are going to be more controlled. They're going to be controlled in terms of supervision, as well as have that strong attachment bond that we know that is meant to be important. The relational control piece is the attachment bond of social control theory, right? Sons are going to be less controlled, have more freedom, stay out later, get to work outside of the home, after school, that sort of thing. And so they have more opportunity, essentially, right? And so that right there would explain the gender gap. Now, the theory recognizes that not all families are patriarchal families. The other families are egalitarian families, and in egalitarian families we see more gender equivalence in delinquency. The sons and daughters are engaging in crime at more equal rates than compared to patriarchal families. In egalitarian families, the gender roles of parents are less pronounced, so that means there's less of a gendered division of labor. There's more 50-50 in terms of dad and mom's role, cooking, cleaning, doing the child rearing, more 50-50 and equality in terms of financial and other decision making. And because of that, daughters are either less controlled and thus more likely to engage in delinquency than daughters in patriarchal families, or sons are more controlled and thus less likely to engage in delinquency compared to boys in patriarchal families. Now, there's some data that supports this theory, especially with regard to just the gender gap. There's data that supports differences in rates of delinquency between patriarchal families and egalitarian families, but the data can't really answer the question of is it that boys are more controlled or that daughters are less controlled in egalitarian families? It can't quite answer that question. So what's the problem with all of this? Hopefully you're thinking this already, it's largely based on assumptions of a traditional nuclear family that has two heterosexual parents, and we know that's just not what all families are like. Now, it also basically indirectly suggests that traditional gender roles are protective for girls, but not for boys. So if families transcend those traditional gender roles, maybe adopt the more progressive attitudes like they would find advocated within feminism, well, then you better watch out, because it could be that your daughters are more likely to engage in crime and delinquency. And so that was a message, that was sent out by this theory and its research base that people took issue with. Now, after this point, there was a nice, significant development in the field with the articulation of life course theory. Life course theory and feminist pathways theory, which we'll talk about next, both can account for the gendered context of offending. By this, what the historical perspectives overlooked in terms of the gender context of offending is that motivations for offending and motivations to quit offending differ across the life course, differ across a person's whole entire life, and everyone's pathway is a little unique, a little different, right? So life course theory argues what a lot of you may have been thinking thus far in this unit. Can't all these singular causal factors work together? Isn't strain and learning and social control, aren't they all important? Don't they interact, in some kind of a way? Can't they influence a person differently at different points in their life? Is learning more important, in, say, adolescence versus social control being more important as an adult? And that's exactly what life course theory argues and can account for. So what the theory does is examine how transitions and trajectories throughout one's life lead to the onset of and desistance from offending. So trajectories are like phases of life: parenthood, college. Transitions, on the other hand, are shorter term, more singular kinds of events: moving, graduating, having a baby, getting married, moving in with somebody, coming out. All of those are good examples. And you can probably see the connection between some of those things, some of those transitions and desistance, right? Like marriage or getting a job, probably rethinking your drug use, say, or how often you go out, how often you engage in risk behaviors, right? Because you don't want to lose your job, you don't want to lose this partner that you just married, right? You have more responsibilities now, that sort of thing. But transitions can also be conducive to crime and can increase risk, right? And examples of that: becoming a victim of crime, losing a job, getting divorced, getting kicked out of school, things like that. Those can be risk factors, essentially, because they can cause strain, right? Or they indicate the loss of a social bond. So there you have a couple of different theories working together, as this theory allows. So the problem with life course theory is not that it doesn't apply to women. It's not that it can't apply to women. It's broad enough to be able to do that. It's not that it makes stereotypical assumptions about women, or assumes that they're inferior to men. And we saw a lot of the historical theories make those assumptions. And it's not that it's, overly concerned with one particular type of offending, like sexual offending, like sex work, right? Like some of the historical theories were. It's mostly a problem because it has focused so much on desistance. A lot of the research, a lot of the scholars who do this work have focused more so on desistance and protective factors. And that has led to them just not looking at the role of the risk factors as much. For instance, they haven't spent nearly as much time looking at the role of trauma and victimization as transitions as they have looked at marriage and employment, for instance, right? This theory's also been guilty of including women in their samples, but then dropping them from the data analysis later. You might remember me making reference to that earlier on in the course, and this theory is one that did do that. But when we do see people really dive in and include women and really compare what's going on with the women in the sample to the men in the sample, we see some slightly different things. Marriage and employment, for instance, this theory has been well known for showing the extent to which marriage and employment really are transitions that lead to trajectories that are associated with desistance from crime. However, that's actually much more true for men than it is for women. And that's probably the best example to give you. So for all of the reasons mentioned above, assumptions that women are inferior, viewing criminal women as masculine, a preoccupation, quite frankly, with sexuality, arguing in favor of traditional gender roles as being a protective factor for women anyway, and leaving women out of the research or dropping them out of analysis. For all of those reasons, when women entered into the field of criminology, some of them, not all of them, they weren't a unified group, some of them got together and decided, we're going to articulate a theory or approach the study of women in crime through a lens that is going to really illuminate the importance of victimization and trauma, because their research suggested that that's extremely significant to account for when you look at women who commit crime, right? So they came up with feminist pathways theory.